Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we've got some excerpts from a sermon, and it's all about disagreements within a community, a church in this case.
Yes.
But it's a topic that, always going to be relevant. It's based on the Apostle Paul's letter to the Roman church.
Right.
And even back then, it seems like they were struggling with conflicts that sound pretty familiar to us even today.
Yeah, they really do. And what I think is so interesting is that it's not even like major theological things that they're disagreeing on. It's
Right.
like these everyday things,
Yeah.
like really just practical stuff that could cause tension and division.
So paint a picture for our listener here.
Sure.
We're in the Roman church just a few decades after the time of Jesus. What was going on there?
Yeah, so Christianity was still pretty new at this point.
Yeah.
And the church in Rome had a lot of different people in it. And so you had these Jewish Christians who, came to believe in Jesus, but they also still held on to their traditions, like their Jewish traditions. So things like their dietary laws and observing the Sabbath.
And I'm guessing that created some problems with the Gentile Christians who were also part of the church.
Exactly. Yeah, Gentile Christians, they didn't have that same background.
Right.
Like they weren't Jewish. And so they didn't have that cultural or religious baggage, so to speak. And the sermon actually uses these terms, the strong and the weak, to describe these two groups.
Okay.
But it's not talking about like the strength of their faith or anything. It's more about how much they clung to those Old Testament laws.
I see.
And the irony is that they were both like genuinely trying to follow Christ,
Yeah.
but they ended up judging each other and even like making fun of each other because of these differences.
So it sounds like it was this clash of cultures more than just beliefs.
Definitely.
And as you said, it wasn't just theoretical. It was affecting their everyday lives.
Oh, absolutely. It was
Yeah.
very real. And, the sermon actually gives a good example. It talks about how some of the Jewish Christians, maybe they mainly ate vegetables because it was so hard to like prepare meat in a kosher way.
Right.
And so some of the Gentile Christians would look down on them for that or even make fun of what they ate.
It's amazing how something as basic as a meal could cause so much conflict. It makes you think food has always been tied up with like who you are and where you belong, even in a church setting.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that's what makes this letter from Paul so relevant for us today. We all have our own backgrounds, our own values and practices.
Right.
And it's easy to feel threatened or judged when someone challenges those, even if it's not intentional.
So how does Paul address this conflict? Does he just tell one group they're right and the other is wrong?
He doesn't. He does something much more nuanced and, in my opinion, much more profound. He introduces this idea of adiaphora.
They die for
Yeah, it's a Greek word basically referring to things that aren't like commanded or forbidden in the Bible.
Interesting. Can you give us some modern day examples to help clarify that?
Sure. Think about the debates that happen in churches now. Things like styles of music, like
Right.
traditional versus contemporary, or maybe whether it's okay to drink alcohol or what kinds of entertainment are acceptable, or even political views. These aren't essential to the gospel. They're more like matters of personal conviction.
So Paul's basically saying there's the core of the Christian faith, and then there are these other things that are open to interpretation.
Exactly. And the sermon actually tells this funny story
Oh, yeah.
about a new convert who sees these church leaders having this big argument about some minor doctrine.
Okay.
And he's just totally confused. He's like, wait, you're fighting about this.
Yeah.
It just shows how silly it is to let these adiaphora tear us apart.
It's a good reminder to take a step back sometimes and ask yourself, is this worth getting upset over? Or could I show a little more grace and try to understand where the other person is coming from? But then I also wonder, isn't there a danger in being too tolerant? I mean, where's the line between acceptable differences and teachings that are actually harmful?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and one we should definitely talk about more. Paul is very clear that God accepts both groups,
Okay.
the strong and the weak, in terms of how they follow the law. His main point is about being united in Christ, not about everyone being exactly alike in every part of their lives.
So I'm really curious now to hear what Paul actually tells the Roman church to do about these differences. I have a feeling there's some timeless wisdom there for all of us.
Oh, definitely. So Paul, he actually gives some pretty practical advice.
Okay.
He starts by saying you shouldn't be judging each other over these like non-essential things,
Yeah.
It's like each person has to answer to God for their own choices.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in what other people are doing and try to make them live by our standards. But in the end, it really is between them and God.
Exactly. And he goes on to say, like, We need to be careful not to make other Christians stumble because of what we do. Like, even in these little things, we need to think about how our actions might affect someone else.
I see. So it's not just about agreeing to disagree.
Right.
It's more about really respecting the other person's conscience.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if we don't understand or agree with their choices.
And that's where love comes in. You know, Paul says the strong should welcome the weak and not fight about these things.
Okay.
It's about building each other up with love instead of tearing each other down with judgment.
So it's less about drawing lines in the sand and more about creating a space where people can figure things out for themselves, guided by their conscience and their relationship with God. But how do we actually live this out? I mean, disagreements happen all the time.
Yeah, that's true, especially in a community as diverse as the early church.
So what does the sermon say?
Well, it says we should focus on the values and goals we share.
Okay. Instead of getting stuck on the little details, like what we eat or how we worship, can we at least agree on the big picture, the core of the gospel? Can we unite around our love for Christ?
I think I understand what you're saying. It's like shifting our attention away from what separates us and towards what we have in common. But to be honest, that's easier said than done.
It is. It takes humility and a willingness to put others' needs before our own preferences.
Right.
And we have to assume the best about people.
Okay.
And believe that they're trying to honor God even if they do it differently than we do.
So humility, understanding, assuming the best. Any other practical tips from the sermon on handling disagreements?
Yes. The sermon also talks about having respectful dialogue.
Okay.
Create a space where people can share their opinions openly without being judged. It's about listening to understand, not just listening to come up to the response.
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially these days, it seems like everyone's so quick to share their opinion.
But not many people are actually listening. But what about when it seems impossible to have a respectful conversation? What if someone's being really harmful or spreading false teachings? Does Paul talk about that?
He does. He's definitely all about grace and tolerance when it comes to non-essentials.
Right.
But he's also clear that sometimes we need to stand up for what's true. He warns against people who cause division and twist the gospel to benefit themselves.
So it's about being able to tell the difference.
Yeah.
Between things that are open to interpretation and things that are really fundamental to the Christian faith.
Exactly. And that takes wisdom and prayer and a deep knowledge of the Bible.
Yeah.
It's not always easy to know where the line is. But Paul says we should ask for guidance from the Holy Spirit and from wise people in the church.
This deep dive is really shedding light on Paul's message.
Good.
It's not about just blindly tolerating everything or rigidly sticking to rules. It's about finding this balance between grace and truth, love, and discernment. And it seems like this wisdom applies to so much more than just the early church.
Oh, for sure.
Like our relationships, our jobs, even how we interact online.
Absolutely. Think about all the arguments people have on social media over things that really don't matter in the big picture.
It's so easy to get pulled into those debates.
Yeah.
You feel like you have to defend your point of view no matter what. But maybe we should take a step back and ask ourselves, is this really worth fighting about? Is it essential to my faith or my values?
That's a great question to ask. And it goes right back to what Paul was saying about Odiophora. If it's not a core issue, maybe we can show some grace and understanding and focus on what truly matters.
This is giving me a lot to think about. And I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. Is there anything else in this sermon that you think is especially relevant for us today?
Oh, yeah. There's this one part that really stood out to me.
Okay.
You know, it's funny how this letter from Paul is still so relevant today. It's like people haven't really changed that much. We still struggle with the same things.
Yeah, like being judgmental.
Right.
Or thinking we're always right and letting little disagreements turn into huge fights.
It's a constant battle, isn't it?
It is. But what I find hopeful is that Paul doesn't just point out the problem.
Right.
He actually offers a way forward.
Yeah, like a path towards unity and putting things back together.
And what's interesting is that it's not about finding the perfect compromise or forcing everyone to agree on every single thing. It's something deeper than that.
Yeah, it is. It's like he wants us to change our whole perspective.
Okay.
Instead of focusing on what divides us, he wants us to focus on what unites us.
I see.
Like realizing that our connection to Christ is way bigger than any differences we might have about these little things.
And it all starts with humility,
Yes.
right? Like admitting that we don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And that God might be working in other people's lives in ways we don't understand.
Absolutely. Humility helps us to be open-minded and really listen when we disagree with someone.
Right.
It's like we can see the other person not as an enemy, but as someone who's also on this journey of faith with us.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've gone from this historical setting of the Roman Church to stuff that we all deal with in our own lives today.
Yeah.
And I think the main takeaway is that disagreements are going to happen.
Yeah.
But we don't have to let them divide us.
That's a great point. We can choose to let those disagreements tear us apart, or we can choose to see them as opportunities to grow,
Right.
to understand each other better, and to deepen our relationships with God and with each other.
So to wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with this question from the sermon.
Okay.
What are those adiaphora, those non-essential things that cause the most tension in your life?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a political issue, a parenting style, or even something as simple as what kind of music you like.
And how can you use what Paul says to handle those differences with more grace and humility? Can you find common ground even when you disagree? Can you put unity and respect first even when it's hard?
Because real unity isn't about everyone being exactly the same. It's not about believing and acting the same way. It's about accepting our differences,
Yeah.
realizing that we each have something special to offer, and coming together as one body, united by our love for Christ.
The sermon actually compares the church to an orchestra, which I thought was really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Like you have all these instruments, each with its own unique sound.
Right.
But when they play together in harmony, led by a conductor who appreciates each one, they create something really beautiful and powerful.
That's a great analogy. So as you go through those inevitable disagreements,
Yeah.
remember Paul's advice.
Yeah.
Be gracious, try to understand and focus on what brings us together instead of what divides us.
That's good advice.
And who knows, maybe you'll even make some beautiful music along the way.